If you hate the tech bros and their overwhelming dominance of our lives these days, and you also love the counterculture movements of the 60s and the 70s, I'm sorry, this video is going to break your heart. And that's because we're once again talking about culture in world building. But this time, we're delving into the complexities of institutional failure, how it gives rise to counterculture, and what eventually happens with that rebellion against the mainstream. Welcome to another episode of Just In Time Worldbuilding with your host, Marie Mullaney. Counterculture is a sociological phenomena that is frequently misunderstood as an aesthetic rebellion or a generational disagreement over stylistic norms. And to that we say, no. Counterculture is not simply teenage rebellion writ large. What counterculture represents is a sophisticated and structural response to the systemic failures of the dominant regime. The Czech dissident Václav Benda coined an amazing term for this. He said counterculture is the emergence of a parallel polis whereby marginalized or oppressed groups construct alternative social, economic, and political institutions when the established state can no longer guarantee safety, provide basic resources, or uphold justice. And that brings us to our first important point about countercultures. They are incubated in environments where the dominant regime, the mainstream, has fundamentally breached its social contract. This breach typically manifests in a few ways: the state's inability to provide physical safety, the collapse of the resource distribution systems, or the disappearance of meaning. That last one is a little hard to understand as a sense of collapse, so let's unpack that. In the mid 20th century, the systemic mode of modernity, the belief that society could be organized through a single, universal, and rational framework, began to falter. This failure led to people questioning, well, the meaning of life. Does it even have any meaning? And many people experience that lack of meaning as a nihilistic collapse. That collapse led to a counterculture, a rebellion against that meaninglessness. And we'll circle back to this later. It is important to understand that these failures do not have to be singular in nature. Oh, no, no, no. They can absolutely come together in one amazing pie of fail. Consider those counterculture movements of the 60s and the 70s. For the baby boom generation, American states' involvement in the Vietnam War and its enforcement of racial segregation represented a profound failure of institutional justice. And it all led to a massive sense of frustration, deprivation, and discrimination. As a survival tactic, whole groups of people who had the least investment in the existing culture rejected the mainstream culture entirely. So, if you're building a counterculture, you first need to establish the points of failure of the main culture. To do this, ask yourself, in what way is the dominant regime failing? Who are they failing? Who are the minority groups that are being most negatively impacted? Who are the allies of these minority groups that aren't being impacted themselves per se, but are standing up on behalf of others? For example, white people advocating for racial desegregation, or straight people advocating for queer rights. Now, this kind of systemic failure generally stems from institutional rot. And that's something we'll talk about more during the patron scroll at the end, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, while counterculture is not an aesthetic rebellion, it is absolutely true that there are aesthetics involved. Everything from language to clothes to hairstyles are associated with counterculture. But why? Well, let's talk about that. In all counterculture movements, we see symbolism and ritual acting as the tools of social cohesion used to forge a group identity. For the 1960s hippies, the choice of handmade or thrifted clothing was a political statement against mass consumerism and an advocacy for self sufficiency. By wearing Afghan coats or tie dyed shirts, they signaled their discovery of non Western aesthetics and the rejection of the mechanistic and conformist suit and tie culture of the 1950s. The Black Panther Party's survival programs provided a powerful example of how mundane actions like eating breakfast can become symbolic rituals of resistance. The free breakfast program was both a means to feed people and a revolutionary vision that exposed the state's failure to care for its children. Food, by the way, makes an amazing ritual always because it acts as an inherently connective force, with communal meals fostering relationships and social cohesion. And if you need some inspiration for what food to serve at what ritual, check out my video on that topic. When you're designing the symbology of a counterculture, don't forget about tattoos and clothing, accessories, and hairstyles. The Vori V. Zakoni, the criminal counterculture born in the Soviet gulags, wore star tattoos to signify that they would never bow to the Soviet state. The women suffragettes who fought for women's rights wore handmade sashes to identify themselves, using a piece of clothing that's easy to make, easy to put on and take off if, for example, you're running from the agents of the state. Magic and other fantasy elements can really come into their own here, with magical tattoos that give you a chance to escape if you're using a runic magic system, or with items of clothing that might create an illusion, or with rings that reveal their presence only to the initiated, but look normal if inspected by the authorities at any other time. And of course, don't forget about art, music especially. Music evokes many, many, many emotions, and it is a great tool for disseminating messages and even giving coded information. And speaking of coded information, survival for a countercultural movement requires communication methods that are invisible to the ruling class. Now, you can, and probably should, develop a coded language the way the British LGBTQ society did with Polari slang. See, not that long ago, being queer was illegal in Britain. And so they developed a lot of slang terms to talk about being queer without saying anything the cops would understand. And as I said, music can play a great role here. Some historians think that during the abolition counterculture in the United States, hymns like Wade in the Water contained encoded instructions for escape routes. But one of the most underutilized techniques of communication is through crafts, as in handicrafts. And this 100% has been used in the real world history, but it's not a part of history often talked about. So allow me to introduce you to the coded needle. During World War II, knitting, yes, two needles and wool, became a tool of high stakes espionage. In Nazi occupied Europe, female resistance fighters recorded German troop movements through coded knitting patterns. A bumpy stitch might indicate one type of train moving troops, while a deliberate hole represented a different movement. They would then pass these knitted codes on to others who could make use of that information. Is this real? Yes, absolutely. But there's also more to the story. Phyllis Latour Doyle, a 23-year-old British secret agent, parachuted into occupied Normandy to gather intelligence on Nazi positions in May 1944. Doyle relayed 135 coded messages to the British military, before France's liberation in August of that year, though her messages were sent via radio, and we'll get to that. Using the code name Paulette, Doyle posed as a poor teenage French girl and bicycled through the region, often under the guise of selling soap, passing on her coded messages. She said, I always carried knitting because my codes were on a piece of silk. I had about 2,000 codes I could use. When I used the code, I would just pinprick it to indicate that it had gone. I wrapped the piece of silk around a knitting needle and put it in a flat shoelace, which I used to tie my hair up. It would take her half an hour to send a coded message via radio. The Germans could identify where the signal was sent from in an hour and a half. You can see the problem, right? She had to constantly move right after sending the message. Sometimes she stayed with Allied sympathizers, but often she had to sleep in forests and forage for food. And she continued her mission until France's liberation in 1944. And that doesn't necessarily have that much to do with counterculture, but I found the story fascinating. For the fantasy world builder, there is amazing potential here for magic and fantasy. You could have thread from fantasy goats that can take encoded messages, or ways to send messages equivalent to the radio that can be detected by the enemy, or crafts specific to your world instead of knitting that create those messages. But language isn't the only part you need to think about in terms of infrastructure of your counterculture. These groups need safe havens. They need a means to survive when the state excludes them. In short, they need to meet Maslow's basic needs at a very minimum. To explore some interesting ways in which this has been handled in the past, let's talk about an exceptionally old counterculture, those who rejected the proto-states that formed on the back of the agricultural revolution. All states extract wealth to pay for services and enrich the elite. Let's be real. In order to do that, they need to know when crops are available to tax them. Grains like rice, wheat, and barley are state making crops because they grow above the ground, ripen simultaneously, and are easily observed and taxed by state agents. Countercultures to states, often located in highland areas, utilize what we could call escape agriculture. They prioritize root crops like yams, cassava, and sweet potatoes, which grow below ground and can be stored in the earth for long periods. These famine foods are difficult for the state to appropriate because they do not ripen synchronously and have a low value per unit weight. An amazing example of people who fled the state and used escape agriculture to survive is an area of Southeast Asia that James C. Scott called Zomia. Now, it's important to note that Zomia is not a country. No one calls themselves a Zomian. Instead, Zomia is the name Scott used to collectively refer to a group of highland cultures in Southeast Asia. These cultures largely chose to be much more nomadic than sedentary and are essentially stateless and have been so for pretty much all of their history. They are a counterculture to the sedentary lifestyle of the rest of the settled world. Their kind of lifestyle is actually reasonably common in the highlands because of the steeper and more remote areas which are difficult to build roads into. And once those roads are built, they are still much more difficult to move goods in and out of, especially using draft animal power. In his book Against the Grain, A Deep History of the Earliest States, Scott describes how early kingdoms in China would levy taxes payable in rice, but could only collect them within the distance rice can travel by wagon without spoiling, and hence, beyond those boundaries, the countercultural people could live. So that is one of the places that countercultural movements might find a home in. highlands, deserts, marshlands, and other inaccessible areas where they can maintain their independence from the mainstream with escape agriculture. However, safe havens that meet countercultural members' basic needs can also exist in urban areas. Oh, yes, it can. Let me tell you about Kowloon, the most epic walled city in Hong Kong. It was a disputed territory on the island where neither British nor Chinese laws were effectively enforced during the colonial period. In effect, because there was a dispute about who owned Kowloon, no one owned it. It became an incredibly dense high rise settlement, functioning as an area where you could get basically any service and anyone could live as long as they didn't antagonize the triad. More about that later. But not every counterculture can create a physically autonomous territory, and where territory is not an option, counterculture depends on underground supply chain. These black markets bypass institutional rules and are often used by those people in the mainstream to acquire illicit goods and services. But for the members of the counterculture, they represent a way to survive. Think of people selling weed or prostitution or gambling, all of which might bring in money for the counterculture. So, when you're setting up your counterculture supply chain, here's what you want to think about. How do they communicate? And how do they keep that communication safe from the mainstream? Where are their safe havens? How are those safe havens identified? Magic can be great here. It can create secret rooms, zero dimension spaces, and other hidden areas. How do they make a living? Do they have a black market? Do they utilize escape agriculture? Do they have some kind of secret magic that gives them things to eat? Or is there some other way in which they meet the needs of their people? Now, of course, all this takes organization. But before we talk about leadership of a counterculture, if you are looking to create cultures and countercultures, may I recommend World Building Blueprints, Volume 1, which is the book I wrote on world building, which you can buy on my website right now. Cultural world building occupies a huge chunk of the book, and it includes a section on symbols and language and rituals and all elements we discussed today. And the book isn't just theory. There are exercises and there are examples, and there is some truly gorgeous art, even in the black and white paperback. And I'll throw in a discount. If you use the word counter, all caps, the first 100 people will get a discount of 20% on the paperback. Links to all that down below. Now, back to your scheduled programming. You know the problem with dominance hierarchies? The problem with dominance hierarchies is that once one damn fool uses it to conquer another damn fool, the idea of the dominance hierarchy spreads like a poisonous wildfire. And here we are, where even countercultures develop dominance hierarchies. For example, let's take a look at two specific counterculture examples, starting with the Vori v. Zacconi, or the thieves-in-law. These were the criminal elite that emerged in the Soviet gulags to govern the dark gaps in Soviet life beyond the reach of the KGB. The Vori were bound by Punyata understandings. These were a set of unwritten but strictly enforced rules of conduct. The code demanded a complete rejection of social norms, including the prohibition of having a family, holding legitimate jobs, or assisting the prison administration in any capacity. A thief-in-law was expected to refuse all work while incarcerated. Even ringing a dinner bell for a guard was seen as a betrayal of the code. This hierarchy was maintained through a sophisticated organizational structure designed to manage resources and maintain discipline. The Opschok Communal Fund was a central pillar of this governance, used to bribe guards, support the families of deceased members, and improve conditions for those in solitary confinement. This system of collective responsibility and underground law allowed the Vori to maintain a monopoly on crime and social order within the prison, eventually allowing them to infiltrate the top political and economic strata after the breakup of the Soviet Union, contributing to the wonderful culture of oligarchy we have in Russia today. Ain't life grand? In the same vein, Kowloon was governed by the triads. Because all institutional governments refused to touch the city, well, someone had to make it work. And someone did. The triads operated the brothels, the gambling parlors, and the opium dens. They ran protection rackets in lieu of police protection. They arbitrated disputes and maintained internal order. The triads were basically the legit authority of Kowloon. So certainly your counterculture could be governed very strictly, perhaps even as strictly as the mainstream culture. And of course, dominance hierarchies always invite conflict, which is a great boon for storytellers who are looking for drama. So, let's talk about the bitch wars. Yeah, you heard me. The bitch wars, the Sacha Vonya, broke out between the pure Vori and the Suki, the bitches, in the 1940s. The Suki were criminals who had cooperated with the Soviet government by joining the army during World War II. But to the Vori, taking up arms for the state was the ultimate betrayal of the code, regardless of how just the cause of the war was. The resulting prison wars between the Vori and the Suki lasted for decades and led to the segregation of gulags into separate zones. Literally, the counterculture went to war with itself. But fun as dominance hierarchies are, and fun as those kinds of wars are, your counterculture leadership doesn't have to be anything near as formal as the triads or the Vori. You could have thought leadership only, as we had with the feminist movements. There wasn't a dominance hierarchy per se, but there were philosophers and activists who organized and provided content. Or the 1960s hippie movement, which was very anarchy focused, and they didn't have a leadership structure either. So, you don't have to go full dominance hierarchy. Your counterculture can be much more loosely organized, perhaps even fully anti-dominance hierarchy. So, questions to ask yourself when you're setting up your countercultural leadership. Are there dominance hierarchies in the counterculture? If not, how are they organized, if at all? If yes, what does the hierarchy look like? Who provides thought leadership for the counterculture? Who writes philosophy tracts? Who provides podcasts? Whatever the means is for disseminating information, what is that means and who provides it and how is that distributed to the rest of the counterculture? And don't forget magic and fantasy here, obviously. And now, let's finally pay off that hook about hippies and tech bros and the tragedy of the 1980s. Really, there's only two ways a counterculture ends. It's either co-opted and commodified by the mainstream, or it infiltrates the power structures of the mainstream and becomes the new status quo. And I think you can guess where this is going. The hippies were co-opted in what is called, I kid you not, the Californian ideology. The Californian ideology represents the weirdest damn fusion of countercultural ideals of the hippies and capitalist ambition that you can imagine. Basically, it fused anarchy with capitalism, giving birth to the many-headed monster that governs the tech world we know today. In essence, tech bro culture inherited the anti-authoritarianism of the hippie. They hated traditional structures like banks and old media and old hierarchy of corporates. So when those kids created companies, they created the wear jeans to work culture and the more casual office environment. And they fostered a sense of community. We're all in this startup together and we're building this computer out of the garage of our parents, that kind of thing. But the owner of that company is still purely capital. He's the guy with the capital who makes all of the money from the profits. And they were very capitalist, operating in one of the most competitive frameworks in history. Steve Jobs is actually a perfect example of this. He integrated the 1960s rock and roll sensibilities and counterculture values, for example, Eastern philosophy and LSD experiences, into the ethos of Apple, commodifying it into consumer technology and making literal billions. So, yeah, co-option. Great job, hippies. Anyway, there are three strategies for co-opting a counterculture into the mainstream. First is classic co-option. The mainstream culture appropriates the symbols of a counterculture, but negates its rebellious meanings, turning them into fashionable commodities like tie-dye shirts for sale. Kind of defeats the object. Then there's hip consumerism. This is a symbiotic relationship where corporations respond to countercultural critiques by offering originality and rebellion through creative consumption, also known as performative activism. Sorry, did I say that out loud? All the corporate we care messages might be getting to me. And then there is repoliticizing co-option. Sometimes the counterculture strikes back through a process of reclaiming its co-opted meanings, basically reclaiming their symbols rather than letting the mainstream have them. Okay, so that's co-option, and it's rather depressing. What's the other way countercultures end? Well, it's better, but life is pain, so it's not all golden. The countercultures can essentially win. Now, on the one hand, a counterculture can completely take over the mainstream. Consider the example of decolonization in Africa. Yes, of course, those were political movements that decolonized Africa. What did you think we were talking about? Counterculture is political. Decolonization and anti-apartheid movements built all of the same things we've talked about in this video. Safe havens, means of communication and support, black markets for sustenance, symbols, the list goes on. And when they succeeded, they did in fact supplant the dominant culture with their counterculture. And they suffered all of the problems of a post-revolution movement. If you're interested in why post-revolution movements struggle to build successful societies, check out my video on that topic. The other way a counterculture can win is by infiltrating the state to the point where their goals become the new status quo. Feminism did this to a degree with the emancipation of women and their right to vote being co-opted by mainstream cultures and becoming standard. Same with the civil rights movement. So this is basically when the counterculture's political challenge fails, they don't take over the main culture, but the beliefs of the counterculture are assimilated and it gets to achieve some of its goals and then kind of fades into the background. Only for institutional rot to set in again and kick off the whole cycle once more. I told you life is pain. Basically, counterculture is really a permanent feature of modernity. Whenever the state fails enough people, there will be those ready to create parallel institutions that speak to the needs of the minorities. So if your world doesn't have countercultures, well, it probably should have them. And now, while the awesome members of the channel scroll past, let me tell you about why countercultures are inevitable. The fact is, even the most equitable, most wonderful institutions rot and need renewal. There's this famous idea, often attributed to Martin Luther King Jr., that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It's a beautiful thought. It's hopeful. But without context, it's naive. Many historians today argue that this inevitable progress narrative creates a dangerous complacency. The arc doesn't bend because of some magical gravitational pull toward being good. It bends because people, usually those in countercultures, are hanging off the end of that arc of history, screaming and pulling it toward justice with every ounce of effort and sacrifice that they have. Instead of an arc, think of history as a pendulum. It can swing toward liberty, yes, but if you stop pushing, gravity takes over and it swings back towards authoritarianism, toward bigotry, or towards just simple, boring stagnation. This brings us to Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson had a lot of, let's call them, internal contradictions. But he was obsessed with the idea of institutional renewal. He famously feared that any government, no matter how perfectly designed, would eventually degenerate into elective despotism the moment the leaders became distant from the lived reality of the people. He didn't think that the American Constitution should be a wholly unchangeable relic. Jefferson argued in a 1789 letter to Madison that each generation should have the authority to revise its constitutional order, and he estimated a generation at roughly 19 years. Why? Because he didn't think the dead should rule the living. He believed that if you don't refresh the tree of liberty with the energy of a new generation, and yes, he used much more violent language, the tree just rots from the inside out. So, when we reconcile King's The Arc of Justice and Jefferson's Rot, we find the sweet spot of active hope. Justice is not a moral certainty. It's a conscious struggle against the inevitable decay of power. Counterculture is a refresh button for the social contract. It's the immune system of society identifying the rot and trying to cut it out before it kills the host. If your world has a golden age empire that's lasted 1,000 years without a single protest or underground movement, I hate to tell you, but your world isn't stable. It's a corpse that hasn't yet realized that it's dead. If you made it this far, leave me your favorite counterculture symbol in the comments. And if you want to see more from me on the topic of systemic failure, check out my video on why your world needs outcasts. And I will see you soon for another episode.